In the winter of 1876, high in the remote mountains of the Montana Territory, German physician Theodor Brennan stumbled upon a secret that would haunt him forever. In a cabin 23 miles from the nearest settlement, he uncovered meticulous medical records chronicling 5 generations of inbreeding within one Irish family. But the real horror lay hidden under the floorboards, 7 carefully preserved infant remains, each with identical deformities. The Donnelly family had been practicing selective infanticide for more than a century, erasing any child who showed visible genetic defects to maintain an illusion of normalcy. Brennan's deeper investigation revealed something far more chilling. This was no isolated act of frontier madness, but a calculated genetic experiment perfected over generations and stretching across 2 continents. The trail of this macabre legacy began not in Montana's wilderness, but in the green hills of County Cork, Ireland, during the brutal winter of 1798. By 1874, Montana Territory was a harsh frontier where law existed mostly in theory. The gold rush was fading, and isolation drew those wishing to vanish from society. It was here Patrick Donnelly, his wife Bridge, and their 4 surviving children, Seamus, Moira, Colleen, and Declan, arrived under the guise of Irish farmers fleeing famine. Yet Patrick's uncalloused hands and ink-stained fingers betrayed a life far from manual labor, and Bridge's haunted demeanor hinted at deeper terrors. They paid exclusively in gold coins and carried expertly forged papers claiming they had lived in Brooklyn for 3 years, when in truth they had fled Ireland after their parish priest uncovered what he called an abomination against God and nature. Threatened with exposure, they escaped across the Atlantic, purchasing 160 acres of remote land in a secluded valley accessible only by a perilous mountain trail. The cabin's location ensured no smoke from their chimney could be seen, and no neighbor could stumble upon their home, making it the perfect refuge for a family desperate to bury its darkest secrets. The extreme cold of the Montana mountains could wipe out livestock in a single night, and 6 months of total isolation each year had driven many settlers to madness or despair. Yet the Donnellys built their homestead with a precision that hinted at long experience with such hardships. Patrick and his sons constructed a log cabin with thick heat-retaining walls, small windows to reduce heat loss, and an intricate system of interior partitions to trap warmth in the coldest months. The craftsmanship went beyond standard frontier know-how, suggesting they had either lived in equally harsh conditions before or had sought expert guidance before arriving. Bridge and the daughters prepared for winter with the same meticulous efficiency, preserving meat to maximize storage and minimize spoilage, planting crops suited for short, unforgiving seasons, and rationing supplies with a mathematical exactness that belied their supposed lack of education. Neighbors who saw them on rare supply trips to Helena noticed their unsettling uniformity, pale blue eyes, angular faces, elongated fingers, and the way the children displayed unusual intelligence, strict obedience, and an almost fearful submission to their parents. Conversations overheard by mail carrier Jake Harrison hinted at a disturbing ideology. Whether in Gaelic or English, they spoke of bloodline purity, the strength of proper breeding, and the sacrifices necessary for family advancement. In March 1875, when thawed passes allowed Harrison to reach their cabin for the first time in 6 months, he immediately sensed something was wrong. Fresh boards patched holes in the walls, new chinking filled gaps that hinted at violence, and the frozen ground around the cabin had been recently disturbed. A sickly sweet odor of decay lingered in the air. Bridge answered the door looking frail and gray, her voice thin as she murmured, "We had complications." Inside, Harrison found her in labor, attended only by her teenage daughter, Moira. The delivery unfolded with clinical precision, but the infant that emerged bore severe deformities, an S-shaped spine, a clubbed hand with 3 fingers, an oversized head, and labored breathing. What struck Harrison most was the family's reaction. No shock, no grief, only cold evaluation. Patrick, speaking in Gaelic to Bridge before turning to Harrison, declared the child too delicate to survive the mountain air, calling its early death God's mercy. When Harrison offered to fetch a doctor, Patrick refused with quiet menace, insisting it would be sinful to interfere with divine will. His words sounded practiced, as though repeated many times before. The older boys, Seamus and Declan, returned during the scene, their lack of surprise confirming this was not the first malformed child they had seen brought into and swiftly removed from their family. When Harrison returned 2 weeks later with the routine mail delivery, the infant was gone. Bridge met him at the door with red-rimmed but dry eyes, the look of someone long past the ability to feel fresh grief. "Lost the baby 3 days after you left," she said flatly. "Buried him behind the cabin next to the others. The weak don't survive out here, and it's better that way." That phrase, "next to the others," sent a chill through Harrison. Behind the cabin stood a row of small wooden crosses over freshly turned earth. He counted 4 each, too small for an adult grave, the crude dates carved into them spanning only 8 months. To his seasoned eye, the burials looked wrong, hastily dug, the dirt uneven. The crosses all identical, as if made in advance. They were arranged in a precise line, leaving room for more. Over the summer, Harrison began watching the Donnellys more closely. The children moved with the deliberate caution of people who knew mistakes carried heavy consequences. Moira and Colleen, though only in their mid-teens, worked with the competence and world-weariness of much older women, their eyes shadowed by unspoken knowledge. Seamus, the eldest, had developed a stutter that worsened under his father's gaze and often fell silent mid-sentence, as if remembering what could not be said. Young Declan seemed the most childlike, but Harrison once found him staring at the little graveyard with open terror. When asked, the boy whispered, "Sometimes babies aren't right, and Father says God doesn't want them to suffer. But sometimes, I think maybe God didn't decide." He clamped his hand over his mouth and said no more. On quiet approaches through the woods, Harrison overheard troubling snatches of conversation. Talk of keeping the bloodline pure of the others, back home of how to handle imperfect children, and of sacrifices made by ancestors to preserve what matters. These were not the words of a family merely surviving the frontier. The Donnellys had come to Montana to hide, to live free from the scrutiny of any community that might question their ways, and to carry on practices older than America itself. By the winter of 1875, snow again sealed them off from the world. It was during this second isolation that their dark legacy began to draw notice. In October, a new figure had arrived in Helena, Dr. Theodore Brennan, a territorial physician trained in Vienna, Berlin, and Edinburgh, carrying the most advanced knowledge of hereditary science available at the time. His library included the works of Francis Galton and other pioneers in the still unnamed study of genetics. Brennan had fled Europe under a cloud of scandal. His research into human inheritance and his outspoken belief in controlled reproduction to improve the species had made him unwelcome in respectable medical circles. Montana's remoteness offered him both a fresh start and, as events would soon prove, a case unlike any he had encountered. The frontier offered Brennan the anonymity and independence he needed to pursue his research, without institutional interference, the very same absence of oversight that had drawn the Donnelly family for far darker reasons. In February of 1876, deep in the grip of winter, Jake Harrison braved the treacherous mountain passes to reach Brennan's office in Helena, carrying reports unlike anything the seasoned physician had heard. Harrison described strange lights flickering from the Donnelly cabin. At unnatural hours, smoke patterns that hinted at fires stoked for unusual purposes, and most unsettling sounds that carried across the frozen stillness of night. Dr. Harrison said, his weathered face tense with unease. "I've been in these mountains 8 years. I know what hardship sounds like, and this isn't it. The crying goes on for hours, then stops like someone cut a wire. And the singing, it's wrong. Not just in the melody, like it wasn't meant for human voices at all. Harrison's account continued with troubling observations, lights burning long into the night when fuel should have been carefully rationed, and figures moving outside the cabin during blizzard conditions that should have made any outdoor activity impossible. These shapes appeared unnaturally tall, their movements odd and fluid, distorted in the snow and shadow. Brennan's instincts told him something was profoundly amiss, but the impassable snow made reaching the cabin suicidal. Instead, he turned to research, combing through Irish immigration records and territorial archives for clues about the Donnellys. Their story, rural poverty in County Cork, failing crops, and a desperate flight to America, crumbled under scrutiny. Parish baptismal and marriage records contained no trace of their claimed relatives, and the farmland they described did not match Irish property records. Even more damning was the mismatch between their tale of hardship and the gold they had freely spent securing their remote Montana land and passage west. In New York immigration archives, Brennan uncovered a medical inspection report from 1874 when the family had passed through Ellis Island. Samuel Morrison had flagged them for physical traits in the children, suggesting possible hereditary defects, noting signs of developmental irregularities, and an unusual evasiveness when questioned about family medical history. His recommendation for extended medical detention was overridden by administrators eager to keep immigrant processing moving. Morrison's notes hinted at deeper concerns, behavioral patterns that suggested deliberate concealment of information critical to public health. The more Brennan dug, the more he found references to other Donnelly families scattered across the United States, each appearing at different times but leaving behind the same faint trail, tightly controlled households, secretive behavior, and whispers of a troubling legacy passed from generation to generation. By 1871, a Donnelly family in Pennsylvania had drawn the attention of local authorities for an abnormally high number of infant deaths. 2 years later in Ohio, another Donnelly household came under investigation for suspected child neglect, though the inquiry was abruptly dropped when the family vanished without a trace. These incidents fit a troubling pattern, multiple branches of the same bloodline scattered across states, practicing the same disturbing rituals while moving frequently to stay ahead of the law. The scale of it was staggering. If all were connected, their program of inbreeding and selective infanticide could have claimed dozens of children over decades. As the spring thaw of 1876 opened the mountain passes, Brennan's obsession with the Montana Donnellys deepened. His training told him that isolated communities could develop hereditary problems through limited breeding pools. But this case was different. Every scrap of evidence, Harrison's unsettling reports, the falsified immigration records, the links to other suspicious Donnelly families, pointed to something intentional, a calculated experiment in human breeding carried out across generations. When the weather finally allowed, Brennan set out to see the homestead for himself, presenting the trip as a routine medical call to an isolated family. The journey took a full day through hostile terrain, narrow forest trails, unstable creek beds, and steep, wind-scoured slopes. The isolation was absolute. No signs of other settlers, no recent tracks, no voices but his own. From the outside, the cabin appeared almost idyllic, solidly built, surrounded by well-tended gardens, livestock shelters, and careful water management systems. Yet Brennan's eye caught the details: the small graveyard behind the house, with 11 tiny wooden crosses, their dates spaced with eerie regularity. This was no cluster of losses from disease or weather. It was a schedule. Freshly turned earth and prepared plots showed they expected more. Even the crosses were identical, as if crafted in batches. Patrick Donnelly answered the door, his manner a strange mix of courtesy and guarded hostility. He looked far older than Brennan expected, hair fully white by 45. His hands trembling when he thought himself unobserved, eyes hollow from a lifetime of strain. "We don't need a doctor here," he he insisted, his voice lacking conviction. "We handle our own troubles, as our families always have." Bridge appeared behind him, so emaciated that her dress hung from her frame like fabric on a rack, her hands shaking with either malnutrition illness or unrelenting psychological torment. When she tried to speak, Patrick silenced her with a single sharp glance, a gesture that spoke of years of dominance and the threat of consequences. The children told the rest of the story without words. Moira, at 18, was visibly pregnant, far enough along to have conceived during the sealed winter months, when no outsiders could have visited. Colleen, 16, looked physically older than her years. Her development unnaturally accelerated her submissive manner toward her parents, suggesting experiences that Brennan found deeply troubling. 13-year-old Declan bore the most visible signs of damage. One side of his face, underdeveloped, a limp from spinal curvature and long, hyperflexible fingers that pointed to a connective tissue disorder. In only minutes, Brennan had seen enough to know the truth. This was not a family merely surviving the frontier. This was a closed, deliberate system, its members bound by generations of secrecy, practicing traditions that no outside authority had yet dared to confront. The older children deferred to their parents with a tense mix of fear and resignation, their every movement measured, as if spontaneity might spark danger. Seamus, now 20, could barely speak through a worsening stutter, avoiding all eye contact and halting mid-sentence whenever asked about his family or health, as though remembering punishments for speaking too freely. The cabin itself felt wrong. Too many rooms, heavy curtains, and locked doors that seemed designed not for comfort, but concealment. From behind those barriers came muted noises Brennan could not identify, and faint, unsettling smells, medicinal, organic, and tinged with something he instinctively recognized as deeply unnatural. As Brennan prepared to leave, Patrick pulled him aside with a quiet urgency, his eyes darting toward the cabin. "If I told you God tests families in ways that require terrible choices, would you understand? Could you help without asking questions?" His voice trembled between pride and desperation. "Our bloodline carries strength, but also complications. We've learned to manage them through methods handed down for generations. They worked in the old country. But here people ask questions we cannot answer, without revealing practices they would not understand." The veiled confession left Brennan cold. This was not mere secrecy to avoid gossip, but the deliberate concealment of a system honed over centuries. 2 months later, in July, Brennan received an urgent note from Jake Harrison, delivered by a trapper who had braved the mountain trail. Donnelly woman in bad labor. Something wrong beyond normal birthing troubles. Come quick. For the first time since their arrival, the Donnellys were calling for outside help. The request alone signaled a crisis, severe enough to override their obsession with privacy. Brennan arrived to find the valley sweltering under oppressive summer heat. Inside the cabin, the air was stifling thick with sweat, blood, and a sickly sweet odor that set every instinct in him on edge. In the back room, Moira lay in difficult labor, not with a single child, but conjoined twins fused at the torso, their shared anatomy suggesting they could not be separated with the medicine of 1876. One was clearly stronger, but both breathed, both cried. Brennan expected panic, grief, pleas for God's mercy, but instead the family moved with chilling precision. Patrick and Bridge worked in perfect coordination, Seamus and Colleen setting out instruments that looked more suited to grim necessity than newborn care. Patrick turned to Brennan with icy detachment. Can they be separated? Can one survive as a normal child? As Brennan examined them, his eye caught something beneath the bed. Several leather-bound journals. Inside were decades of meticulous sketches and notes, each detailing infants born with deformities, cleft palates, twisted spines, missing limbs, extra digits. Some entries were dated generations back. This was not the record of a tragedy. It was the ledger of a practice. Each illustration in the leather-bound journals carried precise annotations in both Irish Gaelic and English, with dated entries spanning decades and continents. Some descriptions detailed remedial measures for genetic defects using terminology that far exceeded the medical knowledge of most frontier settlers. The entries formed a clear migration pattern, tracing the Donnelly family from rural Ireland across multiple American states over more than 50 years. The drawings were not simply of external deformities. They included speculative internal anatomy, survival estimates, and what the records coldly labeled quality of life assessments. These were not family keepsakes. They were methodical evaluations, each deciding whether a newborn was fit to live. When Bridge saw Brennan examining the journals, she broke her silence. "The bloodline must be kept pure," she said with solemn conviction. "Weakness cannot be allowed to spread." We learned this truth through hard experience in the old country. To outsiders, it looks like cruelty. To us, it is mercy. Her words were not defensive. They were declarative, as if reciting sacred law. The more Brennan read, the clearer it became. This was not random infanticide. It was a controlled, multi-generational breeding program, treating humans as livestock to be culled and refined. Genealogical charts hidden among the notes revealed that Patrick and Bridge were first cousins, their marriage part of a deliberate inbreeding plan, stretching back 5 generations. The practice, the records explained, began in early 19th century Ireland, with Patrick's great-grandfather, Fergus Donnelly. Influenced by agricultural breeding successes and pseudoscientific racial theories circulating among certain intellectual circles of the time, Fergus believed the Irish could be perfected through selective reproduction. He drew upon biblical genealogies to justify cousin marriages and controlled pairings, convinced this would yield superior intelligence strength and moral character. Early results: children who were intelligent, attractive, and physically robust seemed to confirm his theory. But even then, there were failures, infants born with catastrophic defects, quietly released in what Fergus described as merciful acts to preserve the strength of the line. Now in 1876, Brennan realized the conjoined twins gasping for breath in Moira's bed were not an unfortunate accident, but the inevitable product of generations of genetic narrowing. Their shared cardiovascular system strained to sustain 2 bodies. Their labored cries punctured the stifling summer air. No surgical option existed that could save them with the tools at hand. Yet leaving them to suffer violated everything Brennan had sworn as a physician. That night, as the twins' shallow breathing echoed through the cabin, he pored over the journals, hundreds of pages detailing over a century of selective breeding. Infanticide and human experimentation conducted with the cold precision of a laboratory program. The Donnelly legacy was not just a family secret, it was a science project carried across oceans, perfected in isolation, and maintained at any cost. By the later generations, the Donnelly experiment had evolved into a chillingly organized program, each patriarch refining the rules and tightening the standards for survival. The journals cataloged desirable traits: pale blue eyes, angular features, unusual height, mathematical aptitude alongside unacceptable ones, which included any visible deformity, cognitive impairment, or what they called behavioral irregularities. But the most disturbing section described the so-called enhancement protocol, a calculated effort to accelerate the concentration of these traits by tightening the breeding circle further and further. Patrick's own marriage to Bridge, his first cousin, was the outcome of 4 generations of deliberate inbreeding meant to perfect their ideal bloodline. In some ways, the protocol worked. The surviving family members shared a striking physical uniformity, intelligence above average, and certain specialized abilities. But the genetic cost was devastating. Severe birth defects were common. The older children showed clear signs of psychological instability, and both parents exhibited physical and mental deterioration. When Brennan confronted Patrick with the evidence, the man admitted what his great-grandfather had set in motion. Fergus Donnelly, inspired by elite livestock breeders in Ireland, had become convinced that the Irish could reclaim their rightful superiority through controlled human reproduction. For a time, Patrick insisted the method seemed to work, producing leaders and innovators in potential, if not in reality. But the toll had been horrific. Countless malformed infants released from suffering, all in service to an imagined genetic destiny. From Brennan's perspective, there was no grandeur in this lineage, only a steady accumulation of recessive defects, each generation more damaged than the last. The conjoined twins, gasping for life in their crude cradle, were not proof of superior breeding, but its collapse. They were the inevitable endpoint of a closed gene pool, collapsing under its own mutations. As Patrick and Bridge prepared to end the twins' lives, Brennan intervened. He told them plainly that if they harmed the children, he would return to Helena and bring federal marshals. It was the first time anyone had confronted the family with a threat they could not ignore. Cornered, they relented, though it was clear their compliance came from fear of exposure, not compassion. For 3 days, Brennan did everything possible with the primitive tools at hand to keep the twins alive. But their shared heart and circulatory system could not sustain them. They died quietly in the pre-dawn darkness of his 3rd day at the homestead. Their short lives marked the end of a century-old experiment in human breeding, a secret carried across ocean and hidden in the mountains until it collapsed under its own cruelty. And with their deaths came the first crack in the wall of secrecy that had shielded the Donnelly family from the outside world for 5 generations. The twins' short lives were the final, irrefutable evidence of the ruin wrought by the Donnelly family's century-long obsession with genetic control. Their deaths stripped away the last pretense that this was an act of mercy or a divinely sanctioned duty. Armed with this proof, Brennan secured the authority to fully investigate the family's past. His examination of the 11 small graves behind the cabin, coupled with the meticulous records preserved in their medical journals and genealogical charts, revealed a horrifying tally. At least 23 children deliberately killed for perceived genetic flaws, from visible deformities to behavioral defects the family deemed unworthy of survival. Under the looming threat of murder charges that could carry the death penalty, Patrick Donnelly confessed. The practice, he admitted, began in early 19th century Ireland with his great-grandfather Fergus, who believed he could forge a perfect Irish bloodline by applying selective breeding techniques learned from livestock husbandry. Twisting pseudoscience, warped theology, and the rising tide of social Darwinism, Fergus convinced his descendants that killing defective children was not murder, but a form of genetic stewardship, purging weakness to elevate future generations above the degraded common masses. But generations of maintaining this creed had exacted a crushing psychological toll. Patrick was plagued by severe anxiety and depression, intensified by the undeniable collapse of his genetic experiment. Bridge had suffered multiple nervous breakdowns and bore all the hallmarks of long-term trauma from years of participating in the murders of her own infants. The surviving children were living testaments to the physical and mental wreckage of the family's system. Seamus, the eldest, broke completely under questioning, revealing that he had been forced to help kill malformed siblings since the age of 12. His stutter, vacant gaze, and paralyzing fear of eye contact were the scars of a psyche shattered beyond repair. Moira and Colleen, products of the same inbreeding, displayed both physical irregularities and deep psychological conditioning. They had been raised to see themselves as breeding vessels, prepared through abuse for arranged unions with their own brothers and intended continuation of the purification process. Declan, with his twisted spine, asymmetrical face, and hyperflexible fingers, was a constant reminder of the program's failures. His medical needs were compounded by severe emotional instability from years of witnessing infanticide and cruelty. Territorial authorities soon realized he was as unpredictable as he was fragile. Before any long-term intervention could be arranged, Declan vanished from custody, disappearing into the Montana wilderness without a trace. Prosecuting Patrick and Bridge proved complicated. The scale, secrecy, and generational nature of their crimes were unlike anything the territorial justice system had faced. There was no precedent for trying people whose guilt was bound up in an inherited system of belief and practice, one that blurred the lines between murder cult ritual and primitive genetic science. And yet Brennan knew that whatever the court decided, the Donnelly case had already etched itself into history as one of the most disturbing examples of what could happen when isolation ideology and pseudoscience were allowed to fester beyond the reach of law or conscience. The territorial prosecutor faced a legal puzzle unlike any other: how to charge crimes that spanned decades, generations, and multiple jurisdictions. Defense attorneys tried to argue that Patrick and Bridge were themselves victims of hereditary mental illness, not calculating killers, but the sheer weight of evidence pointed to deliberate, systematic infanticide. The case drew interest from medical and legal experts across the territories. Yet the remoteness of the Montana mountains and the era's primitive communications meant much of the testimony and evidence never reached the wider public. Both Patrick and Bridge died in custody before trial. Patrick succumbed to an apparent stroke, his health collapsing under the strain of seeing his life's work exposed as a catastrophic failure. Bridge died from complications of her last pregnancy, ending in yet another severely deformed stillbirth, a grim final symbol of the genetic collapse they had caused. Brennan's formal reports, published in territorial and later national medical journals, became foundational in the early study of the dangers of consanguineous marriage. They provided some of the first structured evidence linking close inbreeding to a rise in genetic abnormalities. But he withheld the most disturbing truths from the public record: the systematic killings and psychological conditioning that defined the Donnelly legacy. Only after his death in 1923 did his private journals surface, revealing the full horror and his own lifelong torment, recurring nightmares of the conjoined twins, and guilt over the many children he could not save. After the arrests, the Donnelly homestead was abandoned. The land reverted to territorial ownership, left untouched by locals who avoided it not only for its brutal winters, but for the shadows of its past. The small cemetery behind the cabin, with its neat rows of 11 marked infant graves and signs of unmarked burials, remained as a silent indictment, an enduring monument to the moral and human failure of eugenics without ethics or compassion. In the years following the exposure, similar cases surfaced in other isolated communities, hinting that the Donnellys may not have been alone in their practices. These revelations fueled changes in marriage laws, child protection policies, and the push for governmental oversight of remote settlements. The Donnelly case became both a scientific lesson and a moral warning. How the pursuit of genetic perfection, when driven by isolation, arrogance, and pseudoscience, can end in atrocity. Their story stands as one of the darkest intersections of family secrecy. Primitive genetics and frontier lawlessness. A permanent caution against treating human lives as raw material for experiments born from obsession rather than understanding. It leaves behind unanswered questions. Was everything truly uncovered? Were there other families hidden in the wilderness following the same path? And how many such experiments died quietly in the shadows beyond the reach of law or history? Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.